let's talk a little bit about since it is ERISA's birthday month, I thought it would be useful to go back and look, where did ERISA come from? And I learned some things. I didn't know this, the background leading up to ERISA. So we had the Revenue Acts of 1921 and 1926, and they established kind of that basic scheme that we have for retirement plans, where employers could deduct pension contributions and pension funds accumulated tax-free. Participants didn't have a taxable event until the retirement benefit was distributed to them. And then there were required minimum coverage requirements, I guess like our 410B requirements now, and employer contribution requirements. So that goes all the way before ERISA, all the way back to the 1920s, when we had our first federal legislation governing pension plans. And then we had the Revenue Act of 1942, which imposed stricter coverage requirements, participation requirements. And I know we're all really happy to know when this started, the first disclosure requirements, because we all love that's where it began. All these notices and summaries that we had to provide to participants that all began in 1942 with the Revenue Act of 1942. And then moving on to the 50s, the end of the 1950s, we had the Welfare and Pension Plan Disclosure Act of 1959. And this required plan sponsors to file plan descriptions and annual reports with the government. And under ERISA for a while, you had to file your summary plan description with the Department of Labor. So that continued into ERISA. Fortunately, we don't have to do that now. And then the goal here was to give participants enough information to monitor and prevent mismanagement. So the idea was if they provided more disclosure to participants, the participants would monitor what was happening with their retirement benefits. And then the WIPDA, the WPPDA, was amended in 1962 to give the Department of Labor enforcement authority. So you kind of see the pieces from the 1920s to the 1960s kind of falling into place to where we are today. And then a really major event that ultimately led to the passage of ERISA was the closure of the Studebaker-Packard Corporation plant in 1963. So Studebaker had a very generous pension plan on paper. So there was very generous pension benefits promised under the plan, but the plan was unfunded when the plant closed and left participants out in the cold. So it was a major shakeup, a major event that was one of the reasons we ultimately had ERISA passed 11 years later. And another event that led to ERISA was Jimmy Hoffa being convicted of pension fraud in 1964, where he was a trustee of the Teamsters Pension Fund, and he was found guilty of fraudulently arranging $25 million. And of course, this is in 1960s dollars, $25 million in loans from the pension fund and diverting $1.7 million for the use of Hoffa and his cronies, his co-defendants. So it's still, after that, it still took 10 years for Congress to enact legislation to try to rein in mismanagement and breaches of what we now call, under ERISA fiduciary duty, and enact the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which was signed into law by President Ford on September 2nd, 1974. So last week was actually the birthday for ERISA. Initially, employers and labor unions opposed ERISA because they didn't want, of course, more regulation, right? What employer wants more regulation and hoops to jump through? But then they realized that if Congress didn't do it, the states were, right? There was so much concern over mismanagement and fraudulent use of pension assets that they knew the states would pass legislation. So they ultimately came around and were in favor of ERISA, which, as we all know, has very sweeping preemption provisions. So part of the scheme under ERISA was we have a federal law that preempts any state law that relates to employee benefit plans. So that was kind of the deal, is, okay, let's have one set of rules that apply nationwide and not have to comply with various state regulations. Again, it was passed by Congress in March of 1974 and signed into law on September 2nd, 1972. and included all of our little favorite rules, right, that we deal with: non-discrimination rules, fiduciary duty rules, rules regarding prohibited transactions with plan assets, created the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation and PBGC insurance for defined benefit pension plans, and then delegated to the IRS, the Department of Labor, and the PBGC regulatory control over the various aspects of ERISA. And so that's how, that's how we got to where we are today, with a federal law that has fiduciary duty requirements that ensures that plan participants will always be put first, that requires plan assets to be held in a separate trust for retirement benefits, and then also has, going back to the 1920s, the minimum coverage requirements and the non-discrimination requirements that are in both ERISA and the Internal Revenue Code. So that's how we got to where we are today. That's why we have the kind of balloon type decorations in this room, and you have a cookie, because that was 50 years ago. And thank goodness I was only 4 years old when it passed. And Congress was creating my future career. Little did I know, I was in preschool, and here I am talking about it today.